I have gotten in the habit of introducing myself because sometimes we have new people, and I'm John Henry, chairman of the Committee for the Republic. The United States, in my opinion, is the most secure country in the history of the world. Does anyone in our audience tonight go to sleep fearful of an invasion? If so, please raise your hand and identify the foreign aggressor. We are existentially unique. The United States is probably the only country on the planet that does not confront an existential threat. Does anyone tonight disagree? If so, please raise your hand and identify the country that you believe presents an existential threat. The corollary is that we are an existential threat to every country in the world. Does anyone doubt that we can annihilate any nation? Remember, during the 2008 Democratic presidential nomination contest with Obama, Hillary Clinton boasted that if she were president, she would, quote, and I quote, totally obliterate Iran, close quote, if Iran attacked Israel. She was not asked to identify her constitutional authority or explain how obliterating Iran would make the United States safer. Does anyone tonight doubt that our nuclear arsenal is the most formidable in the world? Does anyone doubt that our aircraft carriers, submarine fleet, Air Force fighters and bombers, cyber and space weapons are orders of magnitude above all others? Does anyone doubt that our offensive military spending exceeds the combined total of China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea? We do not need any country to defend ourselves. Does anyone seriously believe that China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea would commit suicide by attacking us? Our greatest threat, in my opinion, is at home. The military, the multi-trillion-dollar military industrial complex. So as one of our former Salon speakers, Ray McGovern, has coined the phrase. He calls it the military industrial counterintelligence media academia think tank complex. We have met the enemy, and the enemy is us. From 1798, when Congress voided our defense treaty with France, until 1949, when we created NATO, the United States flourished with no defense treaties. For 151 years, we remained faithful to George Washington's injunction against entangling alliances in his time-honored farewell address. With no existential threat, then why do we become heretics to the man who was first in war, first in peace, and first in the hearts of his countrymen? There must have been ulterior motives. It was not to defend ourselves. It was to project military power to command the world. We have 3 defense treaties in Asia, with Japan, South Korea, and Australia, that mirror NATO in Europe. Tonight's speaker, John Lander, will explore our defense treaty with Australia. For half of this treaty's life, our Australian treaty, a treaty with Australia, for half of its life, John served in Australia's diplomatic service with a principal focus on China. Do you realize that President Joe Biden is usurping the powers of Congress by using the treaty to inch the United States and Australia into a war with China? John, if John has joined us, we're going to ask John to tell us what ulterior motives are not being debated in Australia. Max, is John with us now? Hi, John. You're 13 hours, are you 13 hours ahead of us?
Yes, that's right. I'm sorry I'm late. I was searching for the link to the meeting.
I went ahead and gave the introduction, and so I've praised you endlessly and told everybody that you have a unique, if a minority point of view.
Well, yes, that is correct.
But we specialize in minority points of view. So
yeah, that's very good. I'm glad you do. You can hear me, I assume.
Yes,
good. Sir. Yes, because my minority point of view is gaining ground. I think I've seen, I try to keep abreast of all of the commentary from all of the analysts here in Australia who are more expert than I, and they are using some of my terminology rather more frequently in their assessments as well. So I think I'm getting somewhere. Anyway, I will proceed with my presentation, and I hope it doesn't take too long. I'd like to thank you for inviting me to address the Salon. I'm feeling rather honoured, but a bit daunted given the impressive list of scholars, analysts and writers that have gone before me. I am not a writer as such. I've written a lot during my 30-year diplomatic career, much of it in relation to China. None of it published, and most of it buried in government archives. All I can do is bring to the table my personal interpretation of current developments regarding Australia, the United States and China in the light of my past experience. One of your previous speakers, Patrick Lawrence, advocated putting the main point first. So here goes. The United States is not preparing to go to war against China. The United States is preparing Australia to go to war against China. A look at the ANZUS Treaty and the way it has been manipulated over time will explain why I have come to this conclusion. Originally defensive in concept, the ANZUS Treaty was seen by Australia from its very beginning as a means to, quote, achieve the acceptance by the United States of responsibility in Southeast Asia to shield Australia from perceived antagonistic forces in the region. It has, however, developed into an instrument for the furtherance of US ability to prosecute war globally, previously in Iraq and Afghanistan, currently against Russia and potentially against China. The ANZUS Treaty, usually referred to in reverential tones as the alliance, has been elevated to an almost religious article of faith, against which any demur is treated as heresy amounting to treachery. Out of an anxiety to cement the US into protection of Australia, the alliance has been invoked as justification for Australia's participation in almost every American military adventure or misadventure since World War II. Unlike NATO or the defence treaty with Japan, the ANZUS Treaty actually provides no guarantee of protection, merely assurances to consult on appropriate means of support in the event that Australia should come under attack. On the other hand, the alliance has facilitated the steady growth of American presence in Australia, to the point that it pervades every aspect of Australian political, economic, financial, social, and cultural life. Australians fret about China buying up the country, but American investment is 10 times the size. They are unaware or uncaring that almost every major Australian company across the resources, food, retail, mass media, entertainment, banking and finance sectors has majority American ownership. Right now, United States corporations eclipse everyone else in their ability to influence our politics. The defence and military weapons manufacturing industries in Australia are now largely owned by US weapons corporations, Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, Boeing, Thales, Northrop Grumman, etc. The deep integration of Australia's defence industries and economy into the US military industrial complex greatly influences Australia's foreign and defence policies. That, plus the capture of Australia's intelligence and policy apparatus through the Five Eyes Network and ASPI, the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, which I prefer to call the American Subversive Propaganda Institute. It has lobbyists from American arms manufacturers on the board, which is headed by an operative trained by the CIA. That means that the US is able to swing Australian policy to support America in almost all its endeavours. Despite the fact that it contains no guarantees of US protection of Australia, the treaty and further arrangements under its auspices, such as the AUKUS deal, and in particular the 2014 Force Posture Agreement, have greatly facilitated US war preparations in Australia. This has accelerated exponentially in the past few years. The United States now describes Australia as the most important base for the projection of US power in the Indo-Pacific. Some of the indications of war preparations are 2,500 Marines stationed in Darwin, practicing for war with the Australian Defence Forces, soon to be joined by the Japanese Defence Forces. The establishment of a regional headquarters for the US Indo-Pacific Command in Darwin in the Northern Territory. The lengthening of RAAF aircraft runways in the Northern Territory at our expense for servicing US fighters and bombers. The proposed stationing of 6 nuclear weapons capable bombers at RAAF Tyndall in the Northern Territory. The construction of massive fuel and maintenance facilities in Darwin in the Northern Territory for US aircraft. The proposed acquisition of 8 nuclear-propelled submarines under AUKUS at the cost of $170 billion for hunter-killer operations in the Taiwan Strait. The construction at a cost of $10 billion of a deep water port on Australia's east coast for US and UK nuclear-powered and nuclear missile-carrying submarines. The long-established satellite communications station known as Pine Gap in Central Australia has recently, and is still being, expanded and upgraded. It is key to the command and control of United States forces in the Indo-Pacific, and indeed even as far afield as Ukraine. The government and right-wing anti-China analysts and commentators here in Australia, whose opinions dominate mainstream media, accept the Defence Minister's contention that this militarisation enhances Australian sovereignty by strengthening the range and lethality of Australia's high-end warfighting capability to provide a credible deterrent to a potential aggressor. Many other analysts and commentators outside the governing elite, including myself, argue that these arrangements effectively cede Australian sovereignty to America. This is especially because of the provisions of the Force Posture Agreement of 2014 entered into under the auspices of the ANZUS Treaty. I understand that a paper about the Force Posture Agreement has been circulated to the committee, so I will just say in summary, it gives unimpeded access, exclusive control and use of agreed facilities and areas to the US personnel, aircraft, ships and vehicles, and gives Australia absolutely no say at all in how, when, where and why they are to be used. All Australian analysts, whether sympathetic or antipathetic to China, agree on one point. That is, if the United States goes to war against China over the status of Taiwan or any other issue, Australia will inevitably be involved. All these preparations are justified by the false premise that China presents a military threat. China has not invaded anywhere. It has never proposed the use of force against other countries. It has in its constitution what it calls the three no's. That is, no military alliances, no military bases, and no use or threat of use of force. It has, however, reserved the right to use force to prevent the secession of Taiwan. It has also recently increased its defence capability in response to the fearsome US naval presence and warfighting exercises just off its coastline. Its defence budget is 1/3 that of the United States, and the bases that it has constructed in the South China Sea pale into insignificance compared to the hundreds of bases that the United States has ranged all around China. So if China is not a military threat, why is it designated as the primary systemic threat of the collective West, led by the United States? The answer, of course, lies in the word systemic. China has expressed a determination to revamp the global financial system to make it fairer for developing countries. Kissinger is reputed to have said, if you control money, you control the world. The US currently controls world finance, and China, with Russia's help, is out to change that. China is the second largest, or by some calculations, the largest economy in the world. It is the major trading partner of over 100 countries, mainly in the global south, but including European and other Western countries, including Australia, of course. So China has the clout to undermine the international rules-based order set up by and for the benefit of the West. It seems that the US has concluded that since it can't constrain China economically, it will have to get it bogged down in a long drawn-out war to hinder its economic growth and hamper its infrastructure development cooperation with other countries. On the 25th of March, 2021, President Biden vowed to prevent China from overtaking the US as the most powerful country in the world. Not on my watch, he said. Nevertheless, the latest CSIS computer modelling, like previous modelling by the Rand Corporation, indicates that all sides involved in a Sino-US war would effectively lose. All of these analyses overlook one significant point. US determination to pursue the Wolfowitz doctrine has not diminished, but has morphed into a strategy of fighting adversaries by proxy. This has been clearly demonstrated by the war in Ukraine. A White House press briefing on the 25th of January, before the Russian intervention, stated that, and I quote, the US, in concert with its European partners, will weaken Russia to the point where it can exercise no influence on the international stage. Political leaders from Biden through Pelosi and onto members of Congress have told Ukraine that your war is our war and we are in it for as long as it takes. Congressman Adam Schiff put it quite bluntly when he said, we support Ukraine to fight Russia over there so that we don't have to fight it over here. In the case of China, defined by the National Defence Strategy as the principal threat to the United States, the proxy of choice is clearly Taiwan. The strategy envisages goading China into taking military action to prevent Taiwan's secession, leaving Taiwan to conduct its own defence with constant resupply of arms and equipment from the United States, and thereby sustaining Taiwan sufficiently to keep Taiwan bogged down, but at the same time avoiding direct military engagement in order to maintain the full capacity of US forces and avoid the possibility of a nuclear conflict with China. If Australia were to make good on its promise to save Taiwan, it would be devastated. To preserve its own assets and to forestall the descent into a nuclear conflict, the US would not engage directly in the defence of Australia. The ANZUS Treaty does not oblige it to. US support would be through massive arms sales to replace our losses, just as currently happening in Ukraine. ASEAN is unlikely to support Australia. It has renewed and upgraded its comprehensive strategic partnership with China, and each member country has infrastructure projects under the Belt and Road Initiative, which they would not want to jeopardise in a no-win war. I believe support from India is also unlikely, despite its membership of the Quad, which is in fact nothing more than a consultative dialogue. India has security commitments to China under the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. It gets its arms from Russia, which of course has a, quote, better than treaty relationship with China. The increasing size of China's economic and by extension military strength, to which Australia contributes important resources and from which it derives so much benefit, is portrayed as a threat to Australia's security. This has Australia trapped in the absurd policy paradox of preparing to go to war against China to protect our vital trade with China. Recent developments in Taiwan, particularly the county and municipal elections, which caused President Tsai Ing-wen to resign her leadership of the pro-independence party, suggest that Taiwan prefers the status quo and is unwilling to be the proxy of the US in a war with Beijing. Australia thus becomes the potential proxy. In the name of the alliance, American service personnel, both active and retired, are now embedded in Australian defence policy-making institutions and in command and control positions within the ADF. All of the American military assets installed in Australia under the alliance and under the AUKUS deal are now described as interchangeable with the Australian Defence Force, thus making it possible for them to be used as putative Australian forces against China, whilst the US stands aside and maintains the same pretense of no engagement as it is doing in Ukraine. This is why I said at the beginning that the US is preparing to send Australia to war against China. While these are the dangers that the ANZUS alliance poses for Australia, if the United States instigates a war against China, there are risks for the United States also. Firstly, I think there would be crippling expense that further exacerbates the United States wealth divide and related domestic political breakdown. Supplying the weaponry and everything else required for a proxy war with China would be a bigger drain on the US budget than the Ukraine conflict. The expenditure would, of course, flow back to the military-industrial complex, constituting a further massive transfer of wealth from the ordinary taxpayer to the plutocrat billionaires. It would blow out the already unsustainable national debt and either take away from expenditure on essential services and infrastructure, or, if they print money, further blow out inflation. The political and social breakdown that the US is already suffering as a consequence of its real economic decline and widening wealth gap, the latter I think is far more important, could only intensify. Secondly, a slide into a direct war would probably be inevitable. Planning a proxy war is all very well as an academic exercise, but sticking with those plans when the fighting starts will be very difficult. There are already politicians and experts in the United States who believe America can win a direct war. So when China starts bombing Australia and good old Aussie mates are dying in massive numbers, the voices of those in the US advocating direct engagement will be amplified. Combined with the already extreme polarization of US politics, in which only war is bipartisan, the risk that the extremists will take the US into direct conflict and a nuclear showdown with China is, I believe, very serious. The folding in of Japan into the AUKUS arrangements would increase the risk that Japan would be obliged to assist Australia in any military conflict with China. And the US, because of its defense treaty with Japan, would then be obliged to join in the fighting, vitiating its plan to avoid direct military engagement. I'd just like to wind up with a little bit of historical irony in which I was personally involved. In the early 70s, we had been completely in the dark about the secret Kissinger visits to China until the plan for the Nixon visit was announced. Feeling blindsided by such a momentous change in US policy towards China, we produced a policy planning paper in 21st of July 1971. It recognised, quote, political disadvantage resulting from the manner in which the United States conducts its global policies. And it argued that this would mean that, quote, the American alliance in a changing power balance will mean less to us than it has in the past. It went on, if anything, this argument has been strengthened by recent United States actions and America's failure to consult us on issues of primary importance to Australia. Accordingly, we shall need now more than ever to formulate independent policies based on Australian national interests and those of our near neighbours. That was the view we developed and advised to government back in 1971. It is even more true today. For example, Australia was not consulted on the precipitate US withdrawal from Afghanistan, despite our role as a loyal supporter of the United States in that ill-advised conflict. Our indignation and protestations were met with President Biden's statement that America acts only in its own interests. Our present predicament is due largely to the failure of a succession of Australian governments to take this analysis to heart and to act upon it. Prime Minister Fraser, who replaced Whitlam, ironically came to the very similar view towards the end of his life, which he set forth in detail in his book, The Dangerous Allies. But it was too late for him to do anything about it. Thank you very much. That's, I hope, been a sufficiently succinct presentation of my view of the ANZUS alliance and the dangers it poses. There is, of course, a great deal more that can be said about the whole situation.
Present way in which our treaty with Australia is being managed, would you, given that, would you prefer to have no treaty with the United States?
Well, I think my preferences are probably not relevant, and it is quite.
No, I'm just asking you your personal view. You think Australia is safer without the treaty than with it?
I think it is possible that Australia would be safer without the treaty. That certainly seems to have been the view that Malcolm Fraser finally arrived at himself when he said that Australia needs the ANZUS treaty for the defence of Australia, or actually he said Australia needs the United States for its defence, but it only needs defence because of the United States. So given that the treaty seems to impose more dangers than benefits, I would think that we might be better off without it. However, the majority opinion in Australia is, even if there are misgivings about the treaty, we still need to have a treaty relationship with the United States. So I don't see Australia moving to a non-aligned position anytime soon. What is mostly being advocated by most pundits in Australia is that we should move to a more independent foreign and defence policy, whilst retaining an alliance relationship with the United States, but which is far more of an equal partnership than one in which the United States simply dominates Australia's actions, particularly with regard to defence.
If I could just interject a couple of points on treaties. At least under United States law, a treaty cannot obligate the United States to go to anyone's defense. Only Congress can declare war. And a treaty is subordinate to the congressional war power. So the idea that even a treaty could give any guarantee is illusory. I wanted to ask, however, the ulterior motive for the United States entering into this defense agreement with Australia. I mean, has there ever been any contemplation that Australian soldiers, the military, would be helping the United States defend our borders in an attack? Or has the exclusive focus been, since the treaty, on the US coming to aid and defend and fight on Australian soil, that no one really thought that this treaty had any reciprocity to it, in the sense that Australia would come and join our fighting forces to defend ourselves from aggression?
Well, you're quite right. The first point, of course, is that the NATO alliance has certainly includes a clause which says that an attack on one is an attack on all, including the United States. Whether or not Congress would actually approve or not seems to be somewhat irrelevant, given the United States' current role in Europe through NATO. But I agree with you. It would be marvelous if the US Congress were in fact able to exercise its power of final decision over whether the United States goes to war or not. But it seems that in recent times in particular, the administration, particularly in the person of the president, has arrogated the war-making power unto itself. In answer to your other point, it is true that right from the very beginning, as I said, Australia saw the creation of a treaty with the United States principally as a security blanket for Australia. It also, over the years, I think, has not just wrapped itself in that security blanket, but has wrapped itself in that security blanket in order to be able to swagger in our region as a kind of sub-imperial power to the United States. Australia has quite willingly adopted the role of promoting US supremacy in our own region. There's no doubt about that. Whether it would include the reciprocity of Australia going to the defence of the United States on the United States homeland is hardly likely to come into question, since the possibility of an attack on the US homeland is, as was set out, I think, in John's introduction, extremely remote. But it has, that sense of reciprocity has in fact involved Australia in joining the United States in support of its military activities in many other countries in the Middle East, in particular in recent times. We were, of course, joined with the United States in Vietnam, and I think Australia was very much to blame for the increase in the United States war fighting in Vietnam. We had a lot to do with encouraging the United States to engage in what turned out to be an extremely damaging and ultimately futile effort.
And the reason why I asked the question, and I think your answer is quite enlightening, that is from the US perspective, because we understand you're Australians, you should have Australia number one, right? Because it's your country. Like we're Americans, we want to have America number one. We don't want to be callous. And so what you've explained really is that insofar as we've used the treaty, it's not to defend ourselves. It's to help Australia get us involved in other imperial wars, whether it's in Vietnam, whether it's in Iraq, whether it's in Afghanistan or something like that, which shows that the ulterior motive is not to defend the United States. The ulterior motive is to project the empire for the sake of empire. I think that you attribute too much rationality. I think you attribute too much rationality to United States projection of force. We spent $2 trillion in Afghanistan to get a worse edition of the Taliban than we began. We leave, we don't have any tears or any regrets, and then move on. We don't even ask, well, what did we do there for 20 years and waste $2 trillion? Empires, in my judgment, go to war, they project power for its own sake. They don't have any strategy at all. It's just the thrill of being number one, whatever that means in a kind of juvenile sense of being the best athlete in your class.
Yes, that's right. Or the desire to be top dog. Your comments prompt me to perhaps quote Chris Hedges, whom I'm sure you know who he is. Yeah. Mm-hmm. He said, the neocons who have led the United States into the serial debacles of Afghanistan, Iraq, and now Ukraine, costing the country tens of trillions of dollars and even greater amounts of destroyed reputational capital, will claim their customary immunity from accountability and cheerily move on to their next calamity. We need to be on the lookout for their next gambit to pillage the treasury and advance their own private interests. That was Chris Hedges' opinion. And it chimes in with what you've just been saying, and I think in what I have set out as well. The motivating factor is imperialistic. It is the desire to preserve what I think is largely now becoming an imaginary supremacy, sole supremacy in the world. The point I made very briefly about the unraveling of the United States control of international finance, I think is particularly pertinent there in that regard. So I can't see how the United States provoking any kind of conflict between Australia and China in the first instance, or any kind of conflict between a combination of Australia, Japan, South Korea, and other allies against China would in fact prevent the process of diversification of control of international trade and finance.
Yeah, I think right after the Soviet Union dissolved, there was a neocon group, I think it's off the Committee for the Present Danger, and it outright said, our goal is to make sure never again will we ever encounter a power that can prevent us from doing anything we want. We got to make sure everyone is a serf on our plantation. Yes, and that was right after the Soviet Union dissolved, and that's exactly where we are.
And that was why I referred to the Wolfowitz doctrine. What you have just described is in fact what Paul Wolfowitz wrote. And so it's this pursuit of, as you put it, making everybody else a serf on the US plantation. I quite like that analogy. Is I think what lies behind everything that the neocons are planning and plotting in Washington, with Australia's help. You see, I've characterized the US, the alliance with the United States and the ANZUS Treaty as an instrument for the protection of US power. But that has been over time, of course, with the connivance of various Australian governments. I think we don't have clean hands in this, and I think it is extremely unfortunate that in so doing we have handed a very significant portion of Australia's sovereignty and certainly our sovereign ability to determine when and where and how we would go to war. We have handed that decision-making capacity to the United States, in the fond belief that the United States will maintain its supremacy in our region. And there are plenty of people in Australia who believe that is in fact possible. And there, I think, is a growing number of people who believe that that is fundamentally impossible, that eventually United States bootprint on Asia, and particularly on East Asia and Southeast Asia, will diminish. Principally because of not only the growing economic strength of China, but the growing economic strength of Southeast Asia, which is clearly determined to collaborate with, cooperate with, work with, and derive benefit from its relationship with China. We have not been able to persuade any country in Southeast Asia, or indeed in any of the Pacific Island countries, to join us in our hostile posture towards China. Papua New Guinea just recently, which is our very closest neighbour, Indonesia being the next closest, Papua New Guinea, after a meeting with the Australian Prime Minister, the Papua New Guinea Prime Minister said, "Our relationship with China has nothing to do with our relationship with Australia. And our relationship with Australia has nothing to do with our relationship with China. We shall pursue both." And Indonesia has said principally exactly the same thing. And it has also expressed quite strong misgivings about the AUKUS deal. And I call it a deal because it's not it's not a treaty. It's not even an agreement. There is no existing document signed by the three parties concerned. And certainly there has been no document presented to the Australian Parliament for debate and assent or ratification. So AUKUS does not have the status of a treaty, and it is a subset of understandings and gentlemen's agreements between the Prime Minister of Australia, the UK, and the United States President, which keeps evolving and changing as it goes along. There are so many developments which are now described as being a part of the AUKUS deal, but it's a very amorphous kind of arrangement. It's very, it's like Jello, you can't pick it up.
Ambassador, I watched your two interviews with Robbie Barwick of the Citizens Party, which were really very powerful interviews and must have had some impact in the rest of Australia. I'm wondering, outside of the LaRouche circles there, has your word been picked up and magnified in the country? Is it beginning to have an impact on the way people think about the danger of war with China?
Yes, it has. Thank you for the question. I did do a brief address on the same subject to my congregation at the Uniting Church, which was also put up on YouTube. It garnered over 76,000 views, not just here in Australia, but all around the world. So it seemed to have made a bit of a splash. We have here in Australia an organisation called IPAN, the Independent and Peaceful Australia Network, which is a network of over 70 social and religious similar organisations. Pardon me. and a very large number of individual members as well. They have adopted fundamentally the same view that I have. And of course, IPAN put out in the national press a call for peace, which gained over 1,000 signatures of individual signatures, and 90 organizations such as trade unions and other organizations like the Pax Christi and so on signed, and it was published in the national press as a call for peace. And it's actually said that we call upon the government to advise its AUKUS partners that Australia will not participate in a war against China and will not allow its territory to be used for such a war. And it went on to call on the Australian government to sign and ratify the non-nuclear non-proliferation treaty. I always find that hard to say. And so on. So yes, there is a growing body of opinion in Australia which runs counter to the official narrative. It is, however, extremely difficult for it to get any really broad display in the mainstream media, because the mainstream media is pretty much captured by the extreme right wing. 80% of all our media in Australia is controlled by Rupert Murdoch, who is quite vehemently anti-China and pro-US. And so, and even our national broadcaster, the ABC, the chief commentator on matters to do with China on the ABC, is a member or an honor, is a fellow, a senior fellow of ASPI, which of course is, as I've pointed out, dominated by the American political view. The counter argument does not gain traction in the mainstream media. It is only those people in Australia who read independent, privately operated media like John Menadew's Pearls and Irritations, or the Schwartz Media's Saturday paper. There is another independent operator who calls his online medium the Crikey newspaper, which Crikey is, of course, an Australian slang expression, meaning, oh my God. That this is one of the main problems that all of us who are sort of in the Independent and Peaceful Australia network are constantly up against, is getting any kind of traction in mainstream media. That having been said, I think nevertheless there is a growing body of opinion that at the very least Australia should avoid any kind of military conflict with China. Even right-wing opinion polls have come to the conclusion that a majority of Australians are of the opinion that we should avoid a war with China, even while a majority of Australian opinion is distrustful.
Yeah, John, could I ask, does the Australian Parliament have authority to pass a law that would say we're not going to war with China, you know, unless we repeal the law? Do they have an active role in foreign policy, or is by tradition is it all given to the Prime Minister and Parliament is just wallpaper?
The Australia is quite different from the United States. You have in your law the authority for war making rests finally in the hands of your Congress. As I say, I think it has been usurped by the administrations, plural, over recent time. But Australia does not have that. The war making power rests in the hands of the Prime Minister. And we saw that, of course, in the case of in the Second World War, when we were firmly a member of the British Empire. we back in the 1950s and coming up into the 1960s, we were still designated as British subjects. And so when Churchill declared war on Germany, the Australian Prime Minister Menzies went on radio and said, "It is my melancholy duty to inform you that Britain is at war with Germany, therefore Australia is also at war with Germany." It was a decision that was taken by the Prime Minister without really any consultation with the Australian Parliament. There is another organisation which is also a member of the network, the Peaceful Australia Network, which is called the War Powers Reform Group, which has been fighting for many years to get a law through the Australian Parliament requiring a final decision on war making to be in the hands of the Parliament and removed from the tradition of leaving it up to the Prime Minister. But for the time being, it is the Prime Minister who can decide whether or not Australia goes to war without really asking anybody else for their permission.
So, John, I wanted to ask you about trade. We've talked, you made some allusion, you referenced it in your initial talk, but if we could get a little more, here in the U.S., well, at least in the committee, we don't have the committee doesn't have a point of view. We have a lot of different views, but there is I'd say the majority view in the committee is that we want to be splitters rather than lumpers. We want to stay out of a war with China, but we want to retrade the economics with China. How do you view, it'd be very valuable for us to get your view on, how do you see the U.S. relationship with China economically? Do you think it's fundamentally flawed? Do you think it's been more detrimental than beneficial? What's your take on that is from your vantage point?
I think for the last quarter of the 20th century, the United States economic relationship with China and trade and investment in particular was seen as a great advantage to the United States because it really enabled the United States to exploit both the enormous cheap labor force in China and the enormous market in China. And that, of course, led to the establishment of an enormous number of singularly important US industries in China. Microsoft, of course, is still heavily in China. Tesla, the electric car manufacturer, is in China, and so on. But with the inevitable growth of China's economic power resulting from all of that development, China has moved from being a country that simply allows access to its labor force and its market to one which has invested more heavily in itself and has developed its own economic strengths, and particularly its industrial strength. And so its relationship in comparison to the United States, the comparison between the two economies has changed significantly. When the United States first started its involvement with China, China was extremely poor. It had a vast number of its population were in poverty. When I was in China in 1974, at the end of the Cultural Revolution, it was very obvious that most people were living almost hand to mouth. That has changed. China likes to say that it has lifted 800 million people out of poverty. It is certainly true that China now has the largest middle class in the world. So this intertwining of United States productive capacity with China's productive capacity is turning to a disadvantage for the United States, sort of its independence, its economic independence from China. The same is true of Australia, of course, as well, although we are not quite so, China is not quite so heavily invested in Australia, and it's not so, we are not so quite so heavily invested in China. Our principal reliance upon China is simply on the income we earn from our trade with China. Our trade with China is 1/3 of our total trade income. So again, a war with China would wreck that. It would impoverish Australia quite quickly. But when I was director of the China section in the Department of Foreign Affairs, which I was on 3 separate occasions, I tried to sound warning signals at the time to urge caution on allowing China, or indeed any other country, but I was principally looking at Chinese investments in Australia, and I argued that we should not allow China to gain a majority shareholding in any key industry in Australia. And although China is heavily invested in things like iron ore mining, it does not in fact actually have a majority control. It does have majority control in one of our electrical distribution companies, which of course is a risk for us. But the intertwining, particularly the globalization of supply chain networks, makes it, I think, extremely difficult for the United States to extricate itself from its economic and investment connections with China. I think, at least from this distance from Australia, looking at the United States, it seems to me that there are still a very, very large number of United States corporations who would resist disinvestment from China. They clearly wish to pursue their investments in China, and that, of course, runs counter to the official desire to reduce the connection between the two. I don't think that the United States will be able to disconnect itself and be a completely separate and independent competitor with China. China is still an enormously important trade partner with the United States as well. I think the United States' effort to block China's access to semiconductors, for instance, won't in fact work. There have been too many other players in the semiconductor industry who have already indicated that they intend to circumvent the attempt to block the provision of high-end semiconductors to China. And of course, ironically, Taiwan is the principal supplier of microchips to China, and China is the principal supplier of some key raw materials that Taiwan requires to make microchips. So there is an interdependent relationship between Taiwan and the mainland in this key area of modern technological economies.
So, hey, Pat, can you jump in here? Pat, why don't you tell John your view on our trade relationship with China and how you view it? I think it's different than what John articulated, but where you think it went wrong, and what sort of remedial ideas you have.
John, it's great to chat with you again. We did have a chat about a month ago when John was on with you.
Right, but others haven't had the. But they haven't had the. I wanted everybody to. I wanted to have everybody.
Let me give my take on this. China felt the West took it down. They had the 100 years or so of humiliation. They struggled to find a way to rebuild their comprehensive national power. And Deng Xiaoping, the genius, said we need foreign investment, foreign technology, foreign know-how, and foreign markets. And when we recognized the PRC in 1979, we gave them MFN trade treatment. Now, by the time 2000 rolled around, we already had an $80 billion a year trade deficit with China. And they strongly supported us giving them PNTR. Now, over the last 25 years, we've won about $5 trillion worth of trade deficits with China. And and our own fault, our corporations in about 1985 moved to stakeholder primacy capitalism, where they said, and I was on the Senate Banking Committee as General Counsel, I saw all this. I first went to China in 1981. I've been going to China a lot through the years. I was on the China Commission for 10 years. And here's what I saw. When those companies felt their own responsibility to enrich their shareholders, and China offered them incentives like an unpriced, an exchange rate that was manipulated and underpriced, they offered them economic incentives to move our industrial and technological base from here to there. It had a very detrimental effect on our society. And you talked about that in your opening remarks. When you
yes, I need my closing remarks.
Can I finish, please? And you talked about the growth inequality and the lack of industrial base and what's been going on in this country. And it's been a terrible impact on this country. And it's one of the major reasons that Trump won the 2016 election. You look at all of those states, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Ohio, Wisconsin, they were all devastated by this whole economic relationship with China. So it's totally imbalanced, and it's been a disaster for the United States of America. I think we have to fix us. I'm not after a war with China, but I am after that we have to fix ourselves, and that should be the thing we need to focus on, not a war with China.
Yeah, well, I couldn't agree with you more. I think you and I are on exactly the same page. And it's the point I was making really about Australia and the level of American control of our economy. We need to do likewise, exactly what you've been saying. I think it would be a great contribution to world peace if the United States would focus on economically restoring itself and thereby decoupling to some extent from China. I don't think any country can afford to have the level of trade imbalance that you have just described. And certainly I don't think the United States can afford it for all sorts of reasons, including the societal ones that you've also talked about. The United States, I think, should employ exactly the same tactics that Deng Xiaoping employed and use all kinds of incentives and indeed some disincentives to encourage American corporations to move their operations back to the United States.
Yes.
To restore a balance. This is the problem at the moment. The economic imbalance between America and China is very much really in China's favor because its industries are based in China, basically, putting it crudely, whereas the military imbalance is very much in favor of the United States.
But that's a temporary phenomenon, because when you're building your economy like China has done, and we're weakening our economy like we have done, the military imbalance will shift as well, and the political imbalance.
Yes,
but you used to call it the golden rule. He who has the gold makes the rules. We've had the gold. We're losing the gold. We're not going to be making the rules. That was what we used to say on the Senate Banking Committee.
Yes, well, you're quite right. I think that's why Kissinger said, "Who controls the money controls the world," and that's what China is moving to. But Pat, I agree with you wholeheartedly. I think the greater contribution that America could make to world peace is to strengthen its economy. not to continue to push its military might all around the world. Because as you say, a country's military strength is ultimately dependent upon its economic strength. And that military strength is being burned up quite rapidly at the moment in Ukraine. A simultaneous conflict with China, if it were to break out in the next, in the immediate future, I think would drain the United States resources to the point where it really would find it very, very difficult to replenish even its military strength, let alone its economic strength.
I think the political consensus is exactly the opposite of what you and Pat have said. Not that I agree with it, but you're attributing rationality and reason to what countries do in their empires. Both parties, Republicans and Democrats, they don't even debate defense budget. It's, $850 billion. They throw more money after it. We're involved right now with an upgrade of $1 trillion in our nuclear arsenal so we can blow up the world 100 times rather than only 75 times. It's insane and lunatic. But this is what what we're engaged in. As you're describing that, we're throwing money of $1.5 trillion just because we get this vicarious thrill of, hey, we're number one, we're top dog. It's a psychology thing that's worthy of a teenager. But that's where we are. That's where we are. And there is virtually no debate when the budget comes up. 850, 900 billion. All right, you have a handful oppose it. So it's not that we don't know how to get there. We don't have the will to do it. We are so addicted to wanting to be an empire, we'd rather fall off the cliff than pull back and say, wait a minute, we're destroying ourselves. And that's what I think is going to happen. We will destroy ourselves.
But the problem is, of course, that you will destroy the whole of the rest of the world with you.
That is true.
Eventually, pursuing the policy that you've just described, which I agree with, it is quite terrifying that at the political level in Congress, the only thing that political parties in America agree on, that they're bipartisan about, is the defense budget. It's quite alarming, of course, that the Pentagon is unable to account for at least half of that, and it's equally alarming that the defense budget of the United States is half of the total federal government's discretionary spending. The spending being poured into the military is quite amazing. And the question is, with a weakening economy, where is that money going to come from? We have the same problem here in Australia, where we're spending more and more and more on our ability to swagger as top dog in our region. I mean, we are imitating the United States on a smaller scale. We have the same problem here that you have also described, that there is virtually no debate between the major political parties about the need for Australia to be militarily the top dog in our region. The problem with particularly the United States being top dog and using its military power to stay top dog is it will be top dog sitting on a pile of rubble.
Yeah.
John, there's a solution which I think has to be introduced here. To both rebuild the American economy and collaborate with China. Now, you referred to the major cause of this war being the fact that China wants to change the economic rules internationally. And there's a growing movement for a new economic order. Now, my organization, the Schiller Institute, the LaRouche movement, has proposed that instead of trying to destroy China, we collaborate with China, and I think Australia should too, on the Belt and Road, which my organization had a role in helping to design. In fact, if you look at the policy of infrastructure development and development of manufacturing, this was the original American system, as developed by Hamilton, later Roosevelt. It's been our tradition. Now, if the United States, which has been offered to join the Belt and Road by China, there's enough work to rebuild the world economy. Most of the world is joining this. So there is a global effort for a new economic order, which some people would rather have war to stop. And these are the financial forces, frankly, who have destroyed the United States economy. Now, we're proposing a discussion of a new economic order. We've even proposed 10 principles based on the question of national sovereignty, no empire, but collaboration through mutual cooperation, something new in history, which is end the geopolitical empire system. Now, how would you see Australia and the United States instead joining with China for the Belt and Road for the mutual benefit of all countries?
Well, again, I agree with everything that you've said. Australia, of course, back in 2014, when it welcomed President Xi Jinping to Australia as an honoured guest and signed a memorandum of understanding for participation in the Belt and Road Initiative, resiled from that position not too long after, in response to mostly protestations from America that we were exposing ourselves to a threat from China. Your point about the BRI, I think is quite correct. It's not just in Asia or in even Eurasia. There are 34 countries in Europe which are members of the BRI, out of a total of about 140 countries worldwide. 25 are in East Asia and the Pacific, 20 are in Latin America, 18 are in the Middle East and North Africa, and 6 are in Southeast Asia. So most of the rest of the world has already showed a great willingness to collaborate with China in the construction of a mutually beneficial economic order. Also, I think it is very significant that just recently in the United Nations, 90 Western countries voted against a resolution for the development of the new global economic order, but over 170 countries voted in favour of that resolution. So the West is kind of a standout, endeavouring to preserve this geopolitical divide between the powerful countries, the imperialist countries, and all of the rest. But so it's really a struggle at the moment between the West and the rest. But of course, there are rational players in both our countries, people in business in particular. So China's creation of the cross-border interbank payment system, which is seen as an alternative to SWIFT, the system of worldwide international financial transactions, which is controlled by Wall Street and London. The CIPS has shareholders who are Western banks. So we have hard-headed business people, banking people, who can see the advantage of participating in China's international payment system as well as SWIFT. And the other interesting point about the CIPS is that it is in fact interlinked with SWIFT. So the Chinese are still demonstrating a willingness to collaborate with the existing institutions in the West, but to do so more on the basis of an equal partnership rather than a subservient relationship.
John, can you elaborate on the weaponization of the dollar and how that threatens to remove the exorbitant privilege, which basically allows all of this massive military spending to take place?
Again, I think there are plenty of people amongst your members who have.
No, we wanted you to hear how you articulate, how you see it.
But looking at it from my distance, it seems to me that the weaponization of the US dollar, that is the imposition of sanctions on countries that the United States does not agree with, the seizing and freezing of other countries' reserves in particular, is leading to many countries that have been holding their reserves in United States dollars to de-dollarize. Of course, we've seen that with Russia and China. They have been the principal buyers of many tons of gold over the last year or so. They're dumping their dollars in favor of gold. A lot of the developing countries, of course, would have much more difficulty doing that because they are in much greater indebtedness to the international financial system, to the IMF and the World Bank and so on, and therefore they're indebted to America. But even they, I think, will, as far as possible, move away from the United States dollar because they see the risk that their assets could be frozen by the United States if the United States takes umbrage with any policy position they adopt. So again, this tendency of the global south, the G70, if you like, the former non-aligned movement, to pursue or try to pursue a balance in relationship between China and the United States, but certainly to continue to develop their collaboration with China is if the United States continues to pursue a military option to slow China down, then the position of all of these other countries will be seen by the United States as inimical to its interest, and it therefore would be likely to start imposing sanctions on them. I mean, the United States did in fact threaten to impose sanctions on India because India would not join the United States in sanctioning Russia. And India basically took the position that it was a non-aligned country and it would not align itself with anyone. And so it sort of refused to go along with American sanctions on Russia. So it has, I think, recognized there is a risk in flouting United States policy. And so have, of course, most of the other members of the G70. And I think over time they will encourage the development of an alternative financial system, and in particular the development of an alternative currency for mutual transaction, which is also taking place under the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, plus other countries that are joining it, in particular Iran and Argentina on the starting blocks. I believe Saudi Arabia has also applied to join the BRICS, and all of them have indicated a willingness to support the development of an alternative common currency for their transactions, bypassing the United States dollar.
Yeah, if I could, I think that history shows that if a country has to choose between power and money, they choose power. I remember years ago, the Prime Minister or President of Pakistan, Zulfikar al-Bhutto, said, "We will eat weeds to get a nuclear weapon to oppose India." And Britain basically chose power over economy, and the pound used to be the international currency. Now it's nothing. Because the species, for whatever reason, psychological, craves power more than wealth. Not that wealth doesn't have a temptation, but it's not going to deter an empire from sailing off of a cliff. That's how strong this addiction is to having this vicarious sense of we're better than you.
Yes, I agree with you, Bruce.
Can I jump in there? I want to make just a couple of points with the distinguished audience. Last year, the United States trade deficit in manufactured goods was over $1 trillion. Secondly, if you're an economist, the formula for GDP includes something called net exports. When you run positive net exports, like most of the Asian countries do, they have export-led growth strategies, it builds your economy and your wealth. When you run negative net exports, like we do, on a major basis across the board, with over last year, I think over 400 trillion with China, 400 billion, it weakens your economy and your ability to employ your people in good jobs. 3, the former head of the NSC, China guy, under Clinton has said when we try to change our policies, the Chinese use our own companies to lobby against us for this Belt and Road Initiative, Gerald. China has the money to do it because we give it to them every year. We give them billions and billions of dollars. So if you don't fix us, all this other stuff is we're moving into being, I think, dominated by China, and I think they'll get our elites to play ball with them to let it happen. So I think we got a huge problem here, and we need to fix ourselves.
I think we can do both.
Well, Pat, I would agree with you and with Bruce. Strangely enough, I think you're quite right. I agree with Bruce that power is addictive, and Australia is in a similar position to the United States in that respect. It is quite clear that our ruling elites in Australia at the moment are very addicted to this whole notion of being powerful. But I agree with you, Pat, that a country eventually cannot be militarily powerful unless it is economically strong. And as the economy weakens, so does your ability to build up your military power projection.
But Warren Coates is trying to get in here. Warren,
Warren, go ahead.
And if I could get in too, John.
all right, yeah, let Warren go first, Todd, and then you next.
And agree with a great deal of what you said, John. In particular, the importance of the United States getting its act together at home, solving its own problems and being more effectively governed and economically efficient and so on. I quite disagree with Pat on the consequence and source of balance of payments deficits in the U.S. There are two sides to it, so one can always put up one or the other. But first of all, I think the U.S. benefited a great deal from our trade relationships with China. The deficits that we incurred, and they've gone up and down in recent years, are at least in part, and I would say predominantly, a result of U.S. fiscal deficits that somebody has to finance. And China has financed a lot of it, i.e. they have enabled the U.S. government to spend more than it raises in taxes through that deficit. So I think the fiscal deficit in the U.S. is a bad thing, and we need to bring it down. But to the extent that we have it, China's willingness to finance it has been a good thing. Well, there were a lot of other thoughts running around, but with regard to our economic policy, with regard to China, setting aside legitimate military concerns about shared technology, which I think is badly abused generally, but there is a core of legitimacy to some of it. Aside from that, trying to beat China, why we're trying to beat them economically is a mystery to me, but not by being better ourselves and outproducing and being, the most efficient and progressive country in the world. Not that way, but rather by stepping on China and putting them down. That's just bad sportsmanship and makes no sense. I think that in our relation with China, China does not always abide by the rules. Unfortunately, we don't either. But my preferred approach in terms of trade relations is to put greater pressure, first of all, to abide by the rules that we played such a big role in putting in place in the first place, which we are increasingly violating. But I think we should put more pressure on China to abide by the rules, play fair, etc., and then compete. We shouldn't try and artificially cut off our trade relations, except for that very narrow bit of genuinely security-related issue, which we've greatly overdone.
Could I respond before the next comment to those 2 points? I was not suggesting that the US should artificially cut off its economic relationship with China. I was saying that it should restore a balance in that relationship, which is quite a different thing. The second point is putting pressure on China to abide by the rules. Part of the problem is that the rules are what China argues are unfair anyway. They are structured in such a way to favor the West and to disfavor the rest. That's why China has said that it wishes to work through the United Nations to effectively rewrite the rules to make them fairer to all. Just another quick comment. China did attempt to abide by the rules with regard to Australia in the WTO. It brought many issues to the WTO, complaints about restrictions that Australia was placing on China's imports and China's investment into Australia. All of the WTO rulings went against Australia, and we ignored every single one of them. And that went on for half a decade before China started imposing or implementing what we called restrictive trade practices on some of Australia's unimportant exports to China. We then immediately called that China's economic coercion of Australia. And even though during that period, our total trade balance with China went up. So I think there's a problem in simply seeking to impose or to oblige China to abide by the rules, particularly because they see the countries of the West, and you mentioned America likewise, doesn't abide by the rules when it does not suit it. So I agree with you to some extent, but I think that the most important thing is what Pat was saying, which is really to restore a balance in the economic relationship between the United States and China.
Good. So Todd, you get the last question here.
Okay, I'll try to make it brief. Can you hear me? I'm checking
Yeah.
mute.
Yeah.
Anyway, John, I got a quick question. Basically, you as an Australian, how do you see U.S. politics? And let me just expand it very quickly. I'm a retired Army officer, and in 2002, 2003, a memo came across my desk from DOD or Department of the Army articulating in full the Cheney Doctrine. And as they expressed it, as this memo expressed it, was that U.S. policy was that we would not tolerate any other country even having the ability to cause us to hesitate in our decision-making. Obviously, that would seem to have an effect on other countries that might object to that a bit. That is our policy. That has been our stated policy, and it's been repeated. My question is, in 2016, somebody brought up in this group, actually, by email, that, well, Trump won, and therefore neoconservatism is dead. It almost knocked me off, my feet. It's so crazy, and for a whole lot of reasons, which I won't bother going into here. But my question regarding, and I've got a book here at hand, Trump versus China by Newt Gingrich, extolling Trump going to war against China. I'm reading a headline right now, GOP pick to lead House China Committee vows to win new Cold War. So I guess my question is, you mentioned neoconservative, and that word has come up a couple of times. But I guess my position as a retired Army officer and former conservative and former neoconservative is there are no good guys anymore left in this country. We're all imperialists. We all belong to a war party. There might be minor differences between factions, but it's an artificial distinction to say neoconservative as if creating a straw man of, well, if we can only get rid of them, everything will be peaceful again, and let's maybe elect DeSantis or maybe re-elect Trump. And so
no.
So maybe you could comment on that a little bit for me, please, from an Australian's point of view.
Well, I think I've already made the point, but I'll make it again, and that is that the Australian perception of politics in the United States is that war is the only policy that is bipartisan, which is virtually what you're saying, that the pursuit of imperial power by the United States is the one thing on which everyone in politics, particularly in Congress, agrees. And of course, that is clear from the fact that the military budget is the only budget that gets passed virtually unanimously, and there's very, very little debate. Whereas if there's a proposal put forward for a budget for the renewal of United States infrastructure, it's debated and opposed and fought over ad nauseam, and it just amazes us here, or certainly me here in Australia, that both political parties contain people who basically argue against budgetary expenditure on the renewal of the United States industrial and infrastructure capacity. It's quite extraordinary to me. But it goes back, I think, to what Bruce was saying, that they are completely mesmerized, addicted to the idea that military power, might is right, and we will just continue to pursue our position in the world through military means. But eventually it won't work because military, of course, is always dependent upon economic strength. One of the ironies here in Australia is that we're spending an increasing fortune on building up our military strength to oppose China. Where are we getting the money from? From China. China is paying for our military buildup, which I think is extremely ironic, and I'm sure that China is very well aware of it. I think I went off track a bit there. So.
Oh, no.
Well, the witching hour is here. John, we want to thank you very much for joining us tonight here and daytime there. This is a very interesting discussion, and your views are should be heard and will stimulate, have stimulated, and will continue to stimulate conversation on our end. And we want to thank you very much.